Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm Dr. Downey and today we're going to discuss the safest steroid cycle. So what is the safest steroid cycle? Well, it's fairly simple. It consists of intramuscular water injections. I'm just kidding. There is no safe steroid cycle. I'm just going over one of the safer options, and I do not advise you do any of this, nor do I advise you ever take steroids, because they're never really safe, no matter what you use. And especially not safe if you're not doing it under medical supervision. With that out of the way, let's get on to it. So I'm naming this the safest steroid cycle because it can be ran for long durations as noted in the studies with minimal suppression and side effects or changes to biomarkers. And essentially the cycle consists of oral testosterone undecanoate. So I spoke about this in the previous video, so go give that a watch if you want to learn all about this. It's about the male contraceptive pill. But essentially, it's not a contraceptive pill, but it is oral testosterone, and you'll learn all of the pharmacokinetics there as well as effects. The only drawback of this cycle, well, one of the only drawbacks, or the major drawback, is that it's incredibly expensive to buy these tablets. But I'm not suggesting you do this, but essentially all the tablets consist of is testosterone undecanoate with castor oil. So essentially you could make that yourself, but I'm not suggesting you do. So why is this the safest cycle? Well, let's just go into the research. I mentioned that it causes minimal suppression, but let's see it in practice. Let's put it to the test. So in this first study, they took healthy eugonadal males, so males with no hormonal issue who are healthy, and they put them on 160 milligrams of oral testosterone undecanoate for 8 months. And if we look at the results, at the top is serum testosterone. As we can see, that didn't change, it was non-significant. If we look which means that this is probably therapeutic replacement. And if we look at the gonadotropins, usually in intramuscular testosterone, after a few weeks, they almost become zero or very low in value. If we look here, FSH did decrease, however, it was still in slight normal range. And if we look at LH, or luteinizing hormone, that did not change. This suggests that after 8 months of 160 milligrams a day, there was no suppression. This isn't the only study that demonstrates it, but it was one of the better ones. So let's compare that to intramuscular testosterone administration. So this is intramuscular testosterone given every 2 weeks, about 200 milligrams. And if we see the top graph, those are the spikes every time it's injected. And as we see here, in the graph below that, there is LH and FSH, and as we can see, there is a declining pattern, meaning suppression is occurring. And then they compared that to oral testosterone. And what's interesting to note is that in this graph, the serum levels were quite stable, although not very high. They didn't reach peaks as high as the previous one, or they did kind of, but as we see here, it's more or less steady state, which goes against what most papers report. And if we look at LH and FSH, there was barely any change. What is also interesting to note is that SHBG decreases drastically, but I'll get on to that just now. So looking at these two graphs, the first one is actually 250 IM testosterone every 2 weeks, so intramuscular, and the other is 240 oral testosterone daily for 4 weeks, split into 120 dosing, so 120 in the morning, 120 in the evening. So the most interesting thing here is the fact that the LH and FSH didn't change in the oral testosterone group, whereas they both had same averaged serum testosterone. So my hypothesis, they haven't really explained why they think that might be. I think it's because the mechanism of action, although these graphs were taken at weekly blood serum levels, the difference is that during the day the graph looks a bit different. There are a lot of peaks and drops with oral testosterone because it has such a short half-life. So you get a massive peak and then a drop below estrogen. So with that peak, you're getting negative feedback and your LH and FSH will decrease in response to that. But as soon as it drops below levels, then your pituitary starts secreting more because you have low testosterone, lower estrogen. So with this fluctuation occurring through the day, you don't have stable levels of exogenous testosterone. It's fluctuating. And that's perhaps why there isn't much suppression. But some may argue this to be a negative, which it is if there's fluctuating levels. But in studies, these fluctuations didn't really change mood or libido. In fact, both mood and libido improved drastically. And of note, as I mentioned, SHBG, or sex hormone binding globulin, decreased drastically with oral testosterone in comparison to intramuscular testosterone. And this probably explains why when taking oral testosterone you have higher free testosterone levels because less of it is bound, and this would have synergistic effects with most other compounds. So I'm just going to quickly go over some of the important facts from the previous video, which you should watch. But essentially it has a very low bioavailability of only 7%, and that's not due to the fact that it's metabolized in the liver via first pass. It actually is absorbed through your lymphatic system because it's lipid soluble, and then it enters your circulation after being absorbed into the lymphatic system. So it doesn't get absorbed into the portal venous system, which goes through the liver for first pass metabolism, because that's with normal testosterone crystals, it is absorbed easily. It just gets deactivated immediately in the liver, and you'd have to take a very high dose to get any effect. So to improve the bioavailability, they did a few studies, and they found that your fat intake, it should be taken with a meal, with the fat intake no less than 18 grams of fat and no more than 45 grams, because whilst having more fat will improve the absorption, over 45 grams there wasn't much of a benefit. Another issue you have to take into consideration is that only 60 to 65% of the weight so if it's 200 milligrams testosterone on decanoate, the ester mix is quite heavy, so only 60% of that weight is actual testosterone, which you need to take into account when calculating dosages. In terms of pharmacokinetics, as we saw in the graphs, it peaks very quickly within 2 to 6 hours, and its half-life is more or less the same. It drops drastically thereafter. So it has a very short half-life, which is why it's typically taken 2 to 3 times a day. So in a cycle, what I would think would be most logical is to dose it once a day with a fatty meal 2 to 3 hours prior to the gym, just so that when you hit the gym, you have that spike and it's already started these muscle protein synthesis cascades, and hitting the gym just further activates other pathways and you get more of a result out of it. And then as soon as you're out of the gym, the levels have dropped already or almost dropping, but still within, and your testosterone will still be within normal range, so you won't be hypergonadal. And this means you could theoretically have high testosterone levels for a period during the day, during your gym period. However, it would be back to normal throughout the rest of the day, which could have its benefits. So if we look here, this is what it looks like to take 300 milligrams in the morning as an AM dose and then PM dose. As you can see, it peaks drastically. But the problem with that is at 300 milligrams or at that dose, DHT becomes a problem. And the reason for that is that a third of the testosterone you ingest is converted by the intestinal lining by 5-alpha reductase into DHT, so you will have higher DHT levels. So what are the side effects? As mentioned, there is no hepatotoxicity since it's not metabolized in the liver. And at therapeutic levels, HDL did decrease quite slightly, and LDL total cholesterol triglycerides stayed the same. But that's at the therapeutic dose. It may change, but again, with the whole peak, using 1 peak a day hypothesis, you're not having elevated or extremely elevated testosterone levels, which means it might not impact them as much. Hematocrit and hemoglobin, the research is a bit mixed, some showing it does slightly increase hematocrit by 0.02, but others saying no effect, but that's at therapeutic doses again. And as we mentioned with suppression, there isn't too much suppression. It's not very suppressive even after long periods with it. And again, fertility, in fertility studies, there's partial fertility issues. Some experience oligospermia, so quite a significant decreased number, but most of the time there isn't much of effect and they couldn't conclude anything from the studies. The problem, or what you'll have to look out for, is that estrogen and DHT do seem to be elevated when taking oral testosterone. Significantly, but not drastically increased. And in terms of gains, when men who were hypogonadal initially, there aren't many supraphysiological studies, but when taken in men who were hypogonadal, it made them gain lean mass whilst losing fat, which is to be expected. So, in summary, I've laid out all of the info. Now let's create a hypothetical steroid cycle, which I do not recommend. So essentially it would look like this. If you were to use that whole peak hypothesis, you would essentially take more than 300 milligrams prior to, or 2 to 3 hours prior with a heavy fat-laden meal to your workout, so 2 to 3 hours before your workout, and essentially it's just a strong pre-workout. It enhances that whole muscle protein synthesis cascade, and this essentially will allow you to run it for longer durations with minimal suppression. However, I still recommend probably 6 to 8 week cycle just because it works immediately, and you should probably take a break from supraphysiological testosterone after that amount of time just to mitigate getting side effects. And the reason I say it's the safest, or one of the safer cycles, is because it's not as suppressive. It has a half short life, which means it produces that rise in testosterone and suddenly drops, so you're never in that high state of testosterone constantly. It also drops SHBG, which means free testosterone is increased. It's not hepatotoxic, unlike other oral-only cycles like SARM cycles and stuff, so this would be safer than those, as well as this having a lot of data to support it. The lipid changes are minimal, as well as the changes to the hematocrit and hemoglobin. Fertility isn't impacted greatly, however, some cases of oligospermia have been reported. Again, more research than SARMs. It does produce that muscle gain and fat loss at the same time, and what you need to look out for are DHT and estrogen related side effects. So I hope you enjoyed that video. Let me know what you think about this possibly being the safest cycle, and I'll see you in the next video.